You ever have one of those moments where everything just clicks, like you're watching something play out for years and suddenly, boom, it all makes sense? That's how I felt when I finally understood why India made the decision to step back from certain trade ties with America. It wasn't random, it wasn't emotional, it wasn't even political in the way most people think. It was strategic, it was bold, and it was a long time coming. See, for decades, the world got used to one power calling the shots. America had its hands in everything: oil, tech, pharma, defense, even food. They weren't just selling. They were deciding who got to buy, and if you didn't play by their rules, they'd pull the rug from under you. Sanctions, tariffs, pressure through backdoor diplomacy, that was the game. And for the longest time, India played along, quietly, carefully, waiting, watching, learning. But the world has changed. The map may look the same, but the power dynamics completely different. And let me tell you something, the new players, they ain't bluffing, they're moving smart. India in particular stopped being the underdog and started writing its own playbook. Not because they wanted to challenge anyone, not because they were looking for a fight, but because they realized that depending on someone who doesn't respect your sovereignty is a risk you just can't afford anymore. Let's rewind. Think back to when India started building its own digital economy. Everybody laughed. They said, "You can't compete with Silicon Valley. You don't have the infrastructure, the capital, the innovation." Fast forward a few years, what happened? India became the largest digital payment ecosystem in the world. They didn't copy the West. They built something different, something better suited to their people. A model that didn't rely on outside approval. And that right there, that was the first warning sign that India wasn't going to keep playing second fiddle. Then came defense. Oh, you better believe this was a big one. For years, India was buying weapons, jets, and tech from all over the world. Russia, France, Israel, the U.S. But every deal came with strings attached. You could buy the product, but you couldn't modify it. You couldn't resell it. Sometimes you couldn't even use it the way you wanted to. That's like selling somebody a luxury car, but telling them they can't drive it past 40 mph. And India said, "Nah, we're not doing that anymore." So they started building their own missiles, fighter jets, submarines, quietly, efficiently, not to impress anyone, but to prepare. But you know what really flipped the switch? You know what made India say, enough is enough? It was the realization that trade with America came with a hidden price tag. You think it's just about goods and services, but no, there's a whole psychological trade-off happening. A silent deal that says, if you want access to our market, you need to think like us, speak like us, and act like us. And India, with all its history, culture, and diversity, said, we good, we'll find another way. Now don't get me wrong, this wasn't about hating on America. It wasn't about resentment, it was about survival, because here's the truth that most folks don't want to say out loud. You can't keep dancing to a tune that doesn't match your rhythm. You can't keep importing philosophies, policies, and products that don't fit your people. At some point, you gotta say, let's build our own sound system. And that's exactly what India did. When the pandemic hit, global supply chains broke down, countries panicked, exports halted, imports dried up. And all of a sudden, India looked around and said, we've been depending on others for too long, never again. That's when the whole Atmanirbhar Bharat movement came to life. Self-reliance wasn't just a slogan, it became a necessity. And while some mocked it, India went to work. Manufacturing took off, agriculture got smarter, pharmaceuticals went global, and trade policies started to reflect a new kind of thinking, one that put Indian interests first. Now here's where it gets really real. America didn't like that. Not one bit, because they were used to partners, not equals. They were used to countries that complied, not countries that questioned. So what did they do? They started playing the same old tricks: trade threats, sanctions, delisting companies, imposing conditions on data sharing, digital taxes, environmental clauses, all dressed up like cooperation, but really it was about control. And India saw it coming a mile away. They didn't flinch. They just pivoted, started trading more with Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America. They signed deals with nations that respected mutual benefit. No strings, no superiority complex, just straight up business. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't isolation. This was insulation. India wasn't cutting ties. They were cutting dependency. You see, most people think power is about how loud you can speak. But real power, it's about how quietly you can walk while still changing the game. India didn't need to announce its exit from old trade routes. They just created new ones, and guess what? Others followed. Countries that were afraid to step away from traditional alliances started looking at India and thinking, if they can do it, maybe we can too. Now let's talk technology. This is the part that really blew my mind. There was a time when every Indian startup wanted to go to Silicon Valley. Now they're building billion-dollar unicorns right at home. Fintech, edtech, biotech, space tech, you name it. And when foreign investors come knocking with conditions, India's entrepreneurs are saying, nah, we're building this for India first. That's a mindset shift. That's freedom. That's the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing you've been underestimated for too long. And now it's your turn to lead. But the real hidden truth, it's not about trade at all. It's about dignity. It's about knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone put a price on it. India didn't walk away from trade with America because it wanted to be defiant. It walked away because it wanted to be different. Independent, unshackled, and that, my friends, is something every nation, every leader, and every individual needs to understand. When you look at how India handled data sovereignty, it tells you everything. America wanted open access to digital data, but India said, our data, our rules. That's not arrogance, that's protection, that's awareness, that's leadership in the digital age, because whoever controls the data controls the narrative. And India wasn't about to let its story be written by someone else. Even in climate negotiations, India didn't cave to guilt tactics. While developed nations were pointing fingers, India said, we didn't create this mess, but we'll clean up our part on our terms. Solar energy, green hydrogen, massive reforestation projects, and yet they still got criticized, still got pushed, because the moment you show strength, some folks start feeling insecure. But India didn't back down. They just kept moving forward, and let's not forget the farmers, the backbone of the nation. They weren't just protesting for better prices, they were standing up for sovereignty over their own food systems. Trade deals threatened to push them into dependency on foreign seeds, foreign prices, foreign policies, and the people said no more. That was a wake-up call, not just for the government, but for the entire country. When your farmers are willing to stand in the cold for months just to protect their rights, you better believe something powerful is happening. So when I say I finally understand why India ended trade with America, or at least moved away from the old system, I mean I really get it now. It wasn't just economics, it was evolution. It wasn't anti-American, it was pro-India, and that's a distinction people need to learn how to respect. Because here's the kicker. India's not closing doors. It's opening them, just not the ones that lead to dependence, manipulation, or silent submission. It's opening doors to fairness, to balance, to mutual respect. And if you can't walk through those doors without trying to dominate, don't expect a welcome mat. So now, when I see India forging its own trade path, standing firm on its own rules, creating its own tech ecosystems and negotiating on equal footing. I see something deeper. I see a nation that's done with begging for a seat at the table. A nation that's building its own table, and guess what? The world's starting to notice, because when you know your value, you don't chase validation. I used to think these trade wars and policy shifts were just political drama. But now I see it for what it truly is, a shift in global consciousness, a reminder that respect can't be bought. It must be earned, and India is earning it the hard way through action, not noise. Through integrity, not intimidation. The world thought India would fold, that it would panic without Western partnerships. But what happened instead? India rose quietly, strategically, authentically. And in doing so, it lit a path for others who have been silenced, sidelined, or sold short. That's why this story matters. That's why this shift matters. Because it's not just about trade, it's about transformation. And once you see it, once you truly understand the hidden truth behind it all, you can't unsee it. Walking away from unequal trade was the beginning of global respect. It didn't happen overnight, and it definitely didn't happen without resistance, criticism, or confusion. But something powerful shifted the moment India decided that dignity was worth more than deals. That decision echoed far beyond the borders of a simple trade agreement. It sent a message to the world that India would no longer be defined by the expectations of others. For decades, international trade wasn't just about economics. It was about leverage, influence, control. Countries with economic power could shape the behavior of those with less. They could write the rules, change the terms, shift the goalposts, and the rest were expected to comply without question. But India reached a point where it said no more. This wasn't a tantrum or a nationalistic stunt. It was a calculated move after years of being part of systems that favored others. Every negotiation came with terms that tilted the balance. Intellectual property clauses that favored Western corporations. Environmental expectations that ignored historical emissions. Technology transfers that never happened. Access to markets that was always conditional, and all of it wrapped in polite diplomacy that made it look like fairness. But beneath the surface, India knew it was playing a game designed for someone else to win. The turning point came when India started realizing it no longer needed permission to grow. It had the workforce. It had the talent. It had the raw materials. And most importantly, it had the will. That will turned into self-reliance initiatives, reforms in manufacturing, investments in infrastructure, and bold declarations that India would no longer be a dumping ground for foreign goods or ideas that didn't serve its people. This wasn't isolationism. It was intelligent independence. India wasn't shutting out the world. It was refusing to be manipulated by it. When India began turning down certain trade deals with America and other Western powers, many saw it as risky. Critics inside and outside the country warned of economic fallout. They said foreign investment would dry up, exports would drop, jobs would vanish, but India had already done the math. What's the point of rising GDP if the terms of that growth make you a servant in your own house? What's the point of foreign capital if it comes at the cost of domestic sovereignty? India saw that unequal trade wasn't just hurting its economy, it was holding back its voice. Whenever India stood up on the global stage and spoke against bias in international institutions, or refused to pick sides in other nations' conflicts, subtle economic punishments followed, funding delays, policy criticism, trade reviews. It was all linked, and India understood that as long as it was tied to systems where others held the keys, true freedom would remain out of reach. So walking away wasn't about isolation. It was about rewriting the relationship. India didn't stop trade. It stopped unequal trade. It didn't reject cooperation. It rejected coercion disguised as cooperation. And when that happened, something amazing began to unfold. Other nations started paying attention. They saw a country saying no and not collapsing. In fact, it began thriving. It began setting its own standards. It began attracting respect, not because it begged for it, but because it demanded it through action. That's when global respect started to shift. It wasn't just the big economies being heard anymore. It was countries like India, who had taken the long road, the hard road, the disciplined road. Nations that had been spectators to global policymaking now saw that it was possible to walk away from unfairness and still succeed. And they started approaching India differently, not as a subordinate, but as an equal. Trade negotiations took on a new tone. The West had to listen, not just lecture. Respect followed clarity. India made it clear it would trade, but on terms that were mutual. No more open markets without reciprocity. No more data access without safeguards. No more defense imports without co-development. No more environmental targets without historical accountability. These weren't demands, they were boundaries, and boundaries are the first step to any healthy relationship. The West began to realize that if they wanted access to India's booming markets, they had to come to the table with balance, not arrogance. As India stood its ground, new alliances began to emerge. Countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, South American nations who had also been on the receiving end of unequal partnerships started to see India not just as a trade partner, but as an example. They saw that it was possible to honor tradition while embracing modernity, that it was possible to grow fast without selling out, that sovereignty could be preserved not just as a political idea, but as an economic principle. Multilateral platforms started giving India more space. Not out of charity, but out of necessity, global supply chains were reimagining themselves. The dependence on a single superpower was no longer viable. The world needed alternatives. And India had become the most credible one, not because it copied the existing model, but because it built something different, something resilient, something confident, the same resilience that pushed India to develop its own vaccines, the same confidence that launched satellites while others doubted, the same boldness that told the world it would not take sides in someone else's war, but would stand for peace always. India's trade pivot also changed how the private sector looked at global business. Domestic entrepreneurs stopped chasing validation from foreign investors and began focusing on building value at home. They created products not just for export, but for impact. They prioritized Indian users, Indian needs, Indian problems. And when foreign investors saw the results, they didn't back off. They leaned in, but this time on India's terms. Global respect doesn't just come from strength. It comes from standards, and India raised the bar. In tech, in pharma, in defense, in space, in diplomacy. Not by begging for a seat, but by bringing its own chair. Walking away from unequal trade meant walking into a new global identity. One built not on what others thought India should be, but what India chose to become. Of course, there were setbacks. Nothing this bold comes without pushback. There were temporary dips in exports, legal challenges at international forums, attempts to pressure through global media, but none of it worked. Because the foundation was solid, India had outgrown the old rules, and no amount of criticism could shrink it back into a box it no longer fit. Even cultural respect followed. Suddenly, Indian traditions weren't seen as outdated, they were seen as timeless. Yoga, Ayurveda, Indian cuisine, Indian cinema, all found renewed global appreciation, not because India marketed them harder, but because the world saw the authenticity behind them, and authenticity breeds respect. The same principle applied to trade. When your principles are real, people may fight you at first, but eventually they follow you. Trade wasn't just about money, it was about mindset, and India's mindset had shifted. It stopped asking, how can we fit into their system, and started asking, why not build our own? That shift created a ripple effect across all sectors, from farmers demanding better MSP to startups rejecting predatory funding. From ISRO building LOC, our space missions to DRDO making world-class defense tech, the country was no longer waiting for validation. It was producing results that demanded respect. The thing is, walking away from unequal trade isn't easy. It requires sacrifice, it requires confidence, but more than anything, it requires vision. You have to believe in what you're building before anyone else does, and that's exactly what India did. It believed that fairness wasn't optional, that sovereignty wasn't negotiable, that progress without dignity was just a fancy form of slavery. When world leaders saw India hold its ground, they didn't all cheer. Some tried to resist, but others took notes. Because there's something deeply magnetic about a country that knows its worth. It changes the way people talk to you, the way they partner with you, the way they perceive you and perception. That's everything in global diplomacy. Walking away was never about burning bridges. It was about refusing to cross ones that led nowhere. It was about saying, if we're going to build something together, it has to benefit both of us. That kind of clarity makes some uncomfortable, but it makes others respect you more. It's the kind of clarity that says, we're open to trade, but we're not for sale. And with every step India took on this new path, that respect deepened, not just from nations, but from citizens around the world who had grown tired of the same old power game. They saw in India a country that could stand tall without pushing others down, a country that could say no without closing its doors, a country that could disagree without being disagreeable. That's how you earn respect. Not by shouting, not by submitting, but by standing and walking away from what doesn't serve you, toward what uplifts you without apology, without fear, without compromise.